Testing, testing, 1 2, 1 2, testing, testing, testing. Whoo, it got a little hot as it went a little bit. Testing, testing, testing. 1 2, 1 2. Okay.
This committee will come to order. Pursuant to notice today, we mark up 8 different measures, and I'm going to ask the members to take their seats. I want to begin by thanking all of our committee members, and I want to thank the staff, too, on both sides of the aisle, for the extensive preparatory work that went into today's markup, including those subcommittees that held their own markups. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements for the record on any of today's business. And I now call up H.R. 4347, the Turkey Christian Churches Accountability Act. Without objection, Royce Amendment 117, in the nature of a substitute, which was provided to all offices on Tuesday morning, will be considered base text for purposes of markup and is considered read and open for amendment at any point. After opening remarks by myself and the ranking member, I will recognize other members seeking to speak on the bill before moving to any amendments, and I now recognize myself to speak. Members, in the midst of a turbulent Middle East lies Turkey, a democratic nation that, despite its Muslim majority, has historically bridged East and West, Christian and Muslim worlds. I have long been concerned that this balance is shifting as Christian heritage sites in Turkey deteriorate and disappear in the face of hostile government policies. Despite optimistic claims by Turkish leaders in 2011 that a revised law would allow all church properties to be returned to the rightful owners within a year, 3 years later, most of those properties remain unreturned. Despite the Turkish government's numerous promises to reopen the Halki Seminary, that seminary remains closed. Of course, no seminary, nobody then to practice the faith, no future church. Recently, 2 Byzantine Orthodox churches, previously expropriated and turned into museums, those 2 former Byzantine churches have been converted into mosques by the Turkish Directorate General of Foundations. There is even legislation before the Turkish Parliament to convert the landmark Hagia Sophia in Istanbul into a mosque. Hence the timeliness of this resolution. As a beacon for religious freedom around the world, and having an interest in seeing Turkey maintain its secular tradition, its respect for freedom of religion, the U.S. must hold Turkish leaders to their promises. By passing H.R. 4347, the U.S. will send a clear message to Turkey that it must return church properties to their rightful owners while providing an objective measure of its progress. I would like to thank Congressman Gus Bilirakis for his contributions to this bill, and without objection, will submit his prepared statement for the record, and I urge my colleagues to support this important bill. I now recognize the ranking member for any remarks on today's markups that he might wish to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup of H.R. 4347, the Turkey Christian Churches Accountability Act. I commend you for introducing this important legislation, and I am pleased to be the lead Democratic co-sponsor. In the last century, thousands of Christian properties in Turkey have been confiscated by successive Turkish governments. The same has happened in northern Cyprus since the Turkish invasion in 1974. Recently, Turkey has returned some properties, but many cases remain unresolved. Clearly, more needs to be done. H.R. 4347 directs the Secretary of State to provide Congress with an annual report through the year 2021 on the status of stolen, confiscated, and otherwise unreturned Christian churches, places of worship, and other properties in Turkey and northern Cyprus. The report should include a comprehensive listing of all properties claimed to have been removed from their rightful Christian church owners and should describe all engagement over the previous year by State Department officials with Turkish representatives. This bill also mandates that the report be included in the State Department's annual International Religious Freedom Report and in the country reports on human rights practices. I want to acknowledge two visitors here today who are in the audience, Archbishop Viken Ikazian and Bishop Anushman Tanilian. I hope I didn't mess the names up too much, but we welcome you here, gentlemen. In this context, let me take a moment to express my concern about recent disturbing anti-democratic trends in Turkey. Over the past several years, we've seen a lot of red flags, questionable trials of political opponents, increased media censorship, propaganda blaming foreigners, and in particular Jews in Israel, for domestic problems, increase of government control over various state institutions, including the judiciary. As Mr. Keating and I wrote in a recent letter to the editor in The Economist, the current government of Prime Minister Erdogan is eroding Turkish democracy. I ask unanimous consent that the letter be included in the record of today's markup.
Without objection.
While I have concerns about Turkey's current course, we should also take note of the bright spots. Negotiations to resolve the 30-year Cyprus dispute are moving along. Ending the division of Cyprus is critical for stability in the eastern Mediterranean and for prosperity on the island. Also, Ankara's vitriol towards Israel has diminished somewhat in recent months. This provides hope that reconciliation between the countries might not be too far off. Turkey and the United States have a long history as NATO allies and partners. Our relationship is strongest when it is based on our shared values, democracy, human rights, tolerance, and justice. When Turkey's commitment to those values is called into question, it damages our partnership and it hampers Turkey's progress as a free and prosperous country. One clear way Turkey could reaffirm its commitment is by returning confiscated and stolen church properties to their rightful owners. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope H.R. 4347 will bring attention to this important issue and make it clear to Turkey that it needs to do more to resolve the long-standing and legitimate claims of the Christian churches. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. And once again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the markup.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. Are there any members who wish to speak on the underlying bill? On the underlying bill, Mr. Rohrbacher. Go ahead.
I just would like to commend you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this legislation. And let me just say that I share the concerns that were just voiced by our ranking member, Mr. Engel. There are some disturbing trends in Turkey. And while we recognize that Turkey has made long-term progress over the last 20 and 30 years, over the last few years, there's been some really reason for concern here, and that people who wish Turkey well need to make sure we're paying attention, and that those trends, the short-term trends that we've seen, do not continue in the wrong direction. And finally, one last point about the specific nature of the legislation that we're dealing with today. Mr. Chairman, I agree with you totally on the substance of this bill. We are expressing our concern about properties that are taken that also have very significance as to the very nature of the government and the nature of the decision-making that's going on in that part of the world. I would just suggest that as we pass this, with my strong support, that we do note that there are probably properties in surrounding countries like Greece, for example, that belong to the Turkish tradition that need to be addressed as well. And people need to respect each other's rights. And it's not, we are demanding today that the rights of Christian churches be respected in Turkey. I would hope that we respect the rights of Islamic and Turkish institutions in nearby countries such as Greece. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Engel for your continued commitment to working across the aisle and marking up legislation to benefit the American people. I'm happy to see forward momentum on a number of bills that I've co-sponsored. It's the responsibility of Congress to prevent terrorist organizations like Hezbollah from growing stronger, to emphasize the importance of our relationship with Moldova, and to express our concern about the timeliness of adoption processes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. But I'd like this morning to speak particularly in support of H.R. 4347, the Turkey Christian Churches Accountability Act, which rightly calls out Turkey for the theft of Christian churches, religious artifacts, and religious artwork. The United States was founded on the principles of religious liberty and freedom, and the respect for religious freedom must be central to the values and ideals that we promote all over the world. Christian communities in Turkey have long suffered from the destruction and confiscation of their holy sites, the forced closure of their theological schools, and restrictions on their right to worship. There have even been reports that Turkish people are prevented from praying in their own churches. Continued persecution of the vulnerable Christian minority in Turkey threatens the survival of their religious tradition. In the 112th Congress, I was proud to work with Ranking Member Berman to offer an amendment during the markup of the Foreign Relations Authorization Act, which called on Turkey to end its repression of its Christian minority and to return stolen churches to their rightful owners. More specifically, the amendment stated that Turkey should end all forms of religious discrimination, allow the rightful church and lay owners of Christian church properties to organize and administer prayer services, religious education, clerical training, community gatherings, and social services, and return to their rightful owners all Christian churches, places of worship, and properties including artwork, relics, and other artifacts. The amendment was overwhelmingly adopted by a vote of 43-1 in committee and became part of the underlying bill, which was passed by the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. This April, I had the pleasure of visiting Armenia on a congressional delegation trip with Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, as well as several other colleagues. On that trip, I was disturbed to hear more on the ground about the persecution of Christians in Turkey and the desecration and fundamental lack of respect for Christian holy sites. More than 2,000 properties destroyed, reused for things like museums, storage, and even a gas station. Today, I'm proud to continue advocating for religious freedom in Turkey and urge support of this important bill. Again, I commend you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Engel, for moving these important pieces of legislation and look forward to their passage. I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. H.RES.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for marking up H.R. 4347, the Turkey Christian Churches Accountability Act, in order to ensure religious freedom for all faith in Turkey. Christians in Turkey and Turkish-occupied northern Cyprus deserve our assistance in ensuring that they can freely practice their faith in houses of worship without fear of hindrance or restrictions. Since the early 20th century, thousands of Christian properties have been confiscated, desecrated, and otherwise taken from their owners in Turkey by the Turkish government, and since the 1970s in northern Cyprus. I have personally been to Turkish-occupied northern Cyprus and seen the devastating destruction to these churches firsthand. It is unacceptable that Turkey has yet to return some of these properties. For example, the Halki Theological School, the main seminary of the Economical Patriarch of Constantinople, has been closed since 1971. Mr. Chairman, a century is much too long for violations of religious freedom to go unanswered, and I am pleased that by supporting H.R. 4347, a message will be sent to Turkey that the United States does not stand for such intolerance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you and Mr. Engel for working in a bipartisan fashion to address actually some of the concerns that I've had with H.R. 4347, because I believe that there has to be balance, et cetera. But, you know, I just remain apprehensive, and I'll have to oppose it simply because, you know, not because I don't have concerns. I do have concerns. I have concerns of the status of stolen and confiscated Christian property in Turkey. For example, I'm concerned about the continued closure of the Halki Theological Seminary, an important Greek Orthodox educational institution in Turkey for training, for one. But I think we did the right thing when Congress directed the State Department to carefully monitor the situation in Turkey, which they have been doing. And when I looked at the 2013 State Department Religious Freedom Report, it indicated that Turkey has been responsive to some of the calls to return stolen and expropriated Christian property. And maybe we need to go further. But how do we do it? And what do we do? And how do we make sure that things are balanced in the best way to work forward with an individual who's been a strong ally of the United States? You know, this comes at a time when we are partnering closely with Turkey on issues that are critical to the U.S. global interests. At this very moment, Turkey is working to secure the release of 80 of its citizens recently taken hostage by ISIS during the insurgents in Iraq. Just a month ago, Vice President Biden indicated during a monumental visit to Cyprus that after a 2-year hiatus, talks were on the verge of speeding up. That's something that I think that needs to be highlighted and we should also talk about. I also, in trying to make a decision on how I was going to and what I was going to do on this particular bill, you know, talked and asked the State Department where we were, and they say this bill will probably or could cause tension between U.S.-Turkey relations, as well as being burdensome on the department so that they can do the very thing that we've directed them to do. So, again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for working on this bill and trying to alleviate some of my concerns. I just think that as we go forward right now, we need a little more balance, and we've got to make sure that Turkey has been an ally that we're working with, and very important ally in the region, and I think that this sends the wrong message at the wrong time. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to, first of all, say that you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Engel have conducted this committee in your tenure in a way that fosters comedy and civility, and I appreciate that. And I appreciate the attempt we've had in the last 2 days with our staffs trying to work together to see if we could modify the language of this resolution to make it mutually acceptable. Unfortunately, we were not able to do that, and as you know, Mr. Chairman, I will be offering a substitute amendment that expresses our concerns about these issues, but in what I consider a more balanced way. The current resolution in front of us is not about whether you favor the return of Christian properties. I favor, all of us favor that. All of us want to see more progress in Turkey. This resolution shortchanges the progress that's been made. Over 800 properties worth $1.5 billion. The restoration of liturgical services in some religious facilities, some very significant religious facilities. I am fearful that in our haste to make a statement that provides understandable comfort to our constituents, we are going to rupture one of the most important bilateral relationships we have right now in one of the most sensitive parts of the world. Turkey isn't a perfect country, neither are we. I know. I come from a Roman Catholic tradition. Catholics suffered enormous discrimination in this country for a long time. But are we willing to junk the relationship with Turkey we need right now? If we're looking at any kind of intervention in Iraq, we need Turkey. Turkey has taken in 1 million refugees, unsung. Enormous act of generosity in that region. Turkey's strategically in a place where it is, as an ally, more important than ever for the United States of America. As we speak, Turkey's had almost 80 Turkish nationals, including diplomats and truck drivers, kidnapped by ISIS in Mosul. We're going to pretend none of that happened, and none of that's about to happen. We're going to make a statement as if Turkey were a country that is at the very beginning of evolution and needs to be lectured by us. And the consequences we will not examine because we're determined to do something else. We are the House Foreign Affairs Committee. We are the committee that Congress counts on to show judicious exercise of judgment, pondering and weighing and balancing consequences. The consequences of the resolution as worded, words matter, I guarantee you will rupture the relationship with Turkey. And by the way, if our object is to get Turkey to show more progress, and I share in that object, this language will only backfire. They have elections pending. We're politicians. A politician in Turkey is going to use this resolution to say, I'm willing to stand up to the United States of America. I'm not going to be bullied. I'm not going to be lectured like we're some tin horn dictatorship here in Turkey when we're not. Turkey's not a perfect democracy, but it is an evolving democracy, and it's one we want to encourage to turn westward, to open up, to liberalize even more than they have. We want a pluralistic, secular society in Turkey. It is the only such in the Muslim world. To treat it with such disrespect in the language included in this resolution is bound to have negative effects in Turkey, and all of the goals I think all of us share in this committee will in fact be set back for a cause that's noble, but for a resolution that's worded in a way that can only be calculated to inflame Turkey, Turks, and the politics of Turkey, and do terrible damage to the bilateral relationship between the United States and Turkey. I urge my colleagues, I'm going to offer a resolution that I think is more balanced, that recognizes the problem, but also says they've made a lot of progress, and let's move forward. Let's encourage them. If you want to vote as a statement that more progress is needed on this subject and that you're on record, my substitute gives you that opportunity, but I pray my colleagues look at the wording of this resolution. I thank the Chairman.
Well, I thank the gentleman. The chair is going to recognize himself, and especially in as much as we worked very carefully on the wording in this resolution. I would just remind the members here that this bill addresses an issue that has frequently been raised by the United States in the past, including at the highest level by President Obama, including raised by our Vice President, Joe Biden, including an issue which has been raised by Secretary Kerry. It has also been raised by our European allies. At none of these previous times has there been any deterioration in our relations or levels of cooperation with Turkey. In fact, the opposite has been true. During or immediately following these dialogues, the Turkish government has made positive steps on property returns. We now face a situation where things are sliding in the opposite direction. And if we do not reassert this principle, we will find, in all likelihood, an acceleration of a trend which will not be reversible. And I think we also have to disabuse ourselves of the notion that every choice that Turkey makes is in response to U.S. actions. Turkey is a mature sovereign state. It evaluates its relationships and cooperation with other countries based on its calculus of what is in Turkey's best interests, not solely in reaction to U.S. measures, certainly not solely in reaction to a report by the House of Representatives. Primary examples of this, one I'd give you, was in 2010 when Turkey voted against the U.S. and the UN Security Council on Iran sanctions. That had to do with Turkey's own calculus of its relationship with Iran. This is a significant action by Turkey, and it wasn't in response to any congressional action. It is clear that maintaining close cooperation with the United States on Iraq and Syria is in fact in Turkey's best interest. Should Turkish leaders choose to point to our raising of this long-standing issue in which they're moving in the opposite direction, if they point to that, this well-known religious freedom issue, an issue they themselves have repeatedly promised to correct as the reason to cut off security cooperation, as I think was implied here, then it would raise legitimate questions about their commitment to church property returns and where security cooperation with the U.S. weighs in their decision-making process. But I think at the end of the day, because the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State are all weighing in with the same intention that we have here, we need to do the same. And with that said, I'm going to recognize Mr. Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to congratulate you and thank you for this extremely important resolution. It's timely. It is worded in such a way, I think, that it strongly encourages and admonishes Ankara to do the right thing. And you even point out in the resolution, you and the ranking member, that there have been some aspects of progress, but it doesn't even come close, frankly, to where they ought to be. Let me just say to my friends and colleagues who unfortunately, the State Department for years has always taken the view that we do not speak about human rights in a substantive way, even though the Human Rights Report couldn't be clear about those rights violations. I'm the one who chaired the Armenian genocide hearing in this room years ago. We had a Turkish ambassador come and testify, and he threatened us right from the witness table that if you bring up an Armenian genocide resolution, we'll take away your base in Incirlik. That kind of friend in the soft underbelly of NATO certainly underscores a weakness, and if that has a chilling effect on our ability to speak about human rights, shame on us. Let me also point out that today is Torture Victims Day. I've written 4 laws called the Torture Victims Relief Act. I'm reintroducing a reauthorization for that legislation today, and I hope friends and colleagues here on this committee will join me in introducing that bill. There are torture victim centers in Ankara and in other parts of Turkey. Torture is endemic. I've held several hearings on the use of torture and I've raised it in Ankara. And as chair of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, the Helsinki Commission for short, I will be in Baku tomorrow and will be meeting with members of the Turkish delegation. And Mr. Chairman, I will put in each of those delegates' hands a copy of your resolution, and we will have a dialogue. Friends don't let friends commit human rights abuses. Let me also point out that Reporters Without Borders makes it absolutely clear, I've chaired hearings on this as well, that the journalists, they claim, and they have good substantive background for it, there are 42 journalists in prison suffering because they dared to write the truth about what goes on or does not go on in Turkey, and especially if anyone mentions the Armenian genocide, watch out. They'll be knocking on your door and it's off to the gulag for you. 72 media people in all. Let me also point out that I'll never forget, after George Bush, first Bush after the Persian Gulf War, kind of perhaps unwittingly suggested that we had the backs for the Kurds, and it looked like they were looking to overthrow and topple Saddam Hussein. Next thing you know, they were all in flight. Talking about refugees, when it comes to Syria, Turkey has very little choice in the streaming of refugees, and we congratulate them for providing temporary housing and help for those who are coming across the border. But when the Kurds came across the border, the line of demarcation between Turkey and Iraq was very strong. If it wasn't for our special forces, I say to my friends, colleagues, because we were there 4 or 5 days after all of these Kurds came to the border and couldn't get across, we would have seen thousands of dead people who happen to be Kurds from the elements, from sickness, and even from attack. Even while I was there, while we were there, a helicopter laden with foodstuffs for Kurdish refugees, women and children, and the elements were killing a lot of little children because it was cold. When people went to get the meals ready to eat, one of the Turkish soldiers shot and killed one of those who were just hungry beyond words. Our military thankfully helped keep things in check. They're friends, they're colleagues, they're friends, I should say, and allies. But we need to speak about human rights. And again, I think this very, very prudently written resolution will make a difference. And we should not act out of fear, because then it invites impunity and a sense that we can do whatever we want, and the Americans and others who are concerned about human rights will muffle their criticism. So again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for this resolution, as well as the ranking member, Elliot Engel.
Would my friend yield for a minute?
Video.
I thank my friend. My only point is I agree with him. We need to speak forthrightly about human rights and abuses that may occur and incursions in democracy. It's how we say it that is important. And I respectfully believe that how this resolution is worded is going to be counterproductive.
I understand it, but let me just say, if I could reclaim or Mr. Royce's time, this is, I mean, the churches, the Christians there are under a constant cloud. The sword of Damocles hangs over them 24/7, 7 days a week. This tells them we have their backs. And again, I think the chairman has crafted a resolution that is very diplomatically articulated, and so I hope the members will support it.
Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. I'm a co-sponsor of this bill. I think it's well written, and I commend the chairman for it. Its passage will build upon the adoption of H.RES 106, which we adopted in 2011, which I and many of us co-sponsored. Put the U.S. House on record calling for Turkey to return Christian religious properties. The vote was 43-1. This legislation is needed to address the ongoing destruction of Christian religious heritage in Turkey. This is a result of the Turkish government's desecration in some cases and just failure to protect in other cases Christian holy sites. Because of this area's ancient history, so many of these churches are tied to an important global Christian heritage. Christians cannot legally train a clergy in Turkey, and the ecumenical patriarchate and the Armenian patriarchate are prevented from owning and transferring property. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has listed Turkey as a serial violator of religious freedom for several years. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom reported, over the previous 5 decades, the Turkish state has, using convoluted regulations and undemocratic laws, they have used these to confiscate hundreds of religious minority properties, primarily those belonging to the Greek Orthodox community as well as the Armenian Orthodox. The state has closed seminaries, denying these communities the right to train clergy. Despite a few public pronouncements vowing to return some religious property, as the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom reports, ad hoc announcements have not resulted in systematic changes in constitutional legal structures that would remedy violations of religious freedom for non-Muslim minorities, some of which are on the verge of virtual disappearance. Now, there is the argument that Turkey will retaliate if anybody brings any of this to their attention. The fact is that France faced a similar issue about a decade ago when its parliament recognized on the parliamentary floor the Armenian genocide. That, as members of this committee know, is a much bigger issue with Turkey than this resolution. The French parliament passed that resolution with France being under threat by Turkey to cut the one thing France cared about, which was trade and French exports. After the French parliament acted, French exports to Turkey tripled over the next 8 or 9 years. So I don't think we should be dissuaded by bluffs, and I think this committee should at least show the fortitude and courage of the French Parliament. If we can't do that, why are we here? I would yield back to the chair unless I will yield to the chair.
So we have, before we have 2 amendments, Mr. Grayson and Mr. Holding, that I was going to bring up on block, but Mr. Connolly, you referenced an amendment that you have at the desk.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have a
You want to offer that amendment?
Certainly.
Okay.
I have an amendment at the desk in the form of a substitute.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Substitute for the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4347, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. It is the sense of Congress that Turkey has made progress in ending religious discrimination and in returning church properties to their owners. It is further the sense of Congress that the Secretary of State, in all official contacts with Turkish leaders and other Turkish officials, should emphasize that Turkey should, 1, endeavor to end all forms of religious discrimination, 2, continue to make progress in allowing the rightful church and lay owners of Christian church properties without hindrance or restriction to organize and administer prayer services, religious education, clerical training, appointments, succession, religious community gatherings, social services, including ministry to the needs of the poor and infirm and other religious activities. 3, to continue the ongoing process being undertaken by the government of Turkey to return their rightful owners all Christian churches and other places of worship, monasteries, schools, hospitals, monuments, relics, holy sites, and other religious properties, including movable properties, such as artwork.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered read. All members now have a copy of the amendment. The Chair recognizes the author to explain his amendment.
I thank the Chair. This resolution is fairly simple. It recognizes progress has been made, but much progress needs to be done. I listened to my friend from California, Mr. Sherman, and I listened to my friend from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, and to listen to them would be to conclude, if one knew nothing else, that Turkey's apparently done nothing with respect to the return of Christian properties. The report cited actually also notes the return of 864 properties worth $1.5 billion. 2013, Mass was held at H.RES Church for the first time in 89 years. Baptismal service was observed at the At-Kamar Church of the Holy Cross for the first time in 100 years. Structures that have been restored, preserved, or begun restoring include the Akmar Church of the Holy Cross, Sirp Vortvats Vorotman Church, St. Nicholas Church, More Petrus, More Paulus, and the Sahindimbi Synagogue, and I'm probably torturing the Turkic language here. Lands associated with the More Gabriel Monastery have been returned. Hebeliyada Theological School, Sirp Giragos Church, H.RES Church, Bamonti Mihitatarian Church School, and Galata Elementary School. Now, one could go on. We're trying to achieve a balance here where Turkey can work with the Christian communities to return Christian properties. I favor that. I voted for H.RES 306. But that was something that brought us together because it didn't gratuitously just bash Turkey throughout the resolution. And I am concerned that that kind of gratuitous language is going to get us into a situation where the relationship is far more complicated and the goals we all seek, in fact, will be retarded rather than progressed. And so I'm urging my colleagues to vote for an alternative that expresses our sense of Congress with respect to the need for Turkey to have a lot more progress on the return of Christian properties, but avoids language that I think can be construed as inflammatory and unnecessary at a very delicate moment in that region of the world. And I urge my colleagues to support the resolution. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. You know, I appreciate your amendment. I appreciate your perspective on these issues. I know that you've been deeply involved in this region of the world. But I am somewhat disappointed because as members, I know myself and Mr. Engel have worked very hard making many changes to the introduced text and accepting changes from members yesterday. And we did that in an effort to get this legislation to a place where I hoped all members could support it. And of course, that's not always possible. But we did make an effort, and in particular, we amended the base text from its original version to include findings that note instances of progress on church property returns to Turkey, as you referenced. We make note of the 2011 reforms to the law on foundations, which provide a process for churches to apply to get their properties returned. We also note that since the enactment of this reform, Turkey has returned over 300 properties to the appropriate church authorities. And further, clauses 23, 24, 25, clause 27, they all point to positive developments in terms of church property being returned, religious ceremonies being allowed, and the historic meeting between Prime Minister Erdogan and the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew back in 2009. But while recognizing these positive developments, there is an urgency on some of the issues that are before Turkey today. Progress on church returns, as everyone here knows, has been haphazard. It's been very slow. The 2014 U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom report notes many religious communities regard this process as biased and, of course, very, very slow. And it highlights that over 1,000 applications by churches to have their property returned have been denied. But that said, even more troubling, this is why this resolution is before us today. Since that time, 2 ancient Byzantine-era Orthodox churches, which had been seized by the Turkish government, rather than being returned to their rightful owners, have been converted into mosques. And there is a, as I referenced earlier, there is a proposal before the Parliament now to do likewise with the Hagia Sophia, the great church in Istanbul. That is one of the most significant religious sites for Orthodox Christians in the world. It is the former Eastern Orthodox cathedral and seat of the Patriarchate of Constantinople for 1,000 years, and for decades has symbolized Turkey's efforts to respect the rights of Christian minorities while promoting the country's secular democracy. I am, and I know many other members, are pretty troubled by what this says about trends in Turkey, and we feel that if we take a stand, we may be able to arrest what would otherwise be a very unfortunate circumstance here. Turkey has not acted positively since we passed the last resolution. We cannot expect sudden progress if we pass the same language again. We need to reference these discussions that are underway in Turkey and these events. And lastly, as to now is not a good time, that argument, which we've heard, and I've partially answered that, but with all respect, this to my own legislation here, we are just making a report. Second, there's never been what is proven to be a bad time to raise it. If you think about it, this issue was raised, as I shared with you, by President Obama, and that was in 2009 when we were relying upon Turkey's support in isolating Iran and pressing Iran to abandon its nuclear ambitions. It was raised by our Vice President, Joe Biden, in 2011 when the Syrian conflict was beginning. It was discussed once again a few months ago by Secretary Kerry on a visit to Turkey and Cyprus as the situation in Syria worsened and as ISIS was gaining greater influence in Iraq. At each of these times, I think it's fair to say, there was no breach in relations or cooperative efforts with Turkey on key U.S. foreign policy and security issues. It was raised because it was important that the United States take a stand. And as I said, Turkey is a mature sovereign state. It measures its actions based on its calculation of what is in that state's best interests. When we have common interests, Turkey will back us. When we don't, it won't. And thirdly, I'd ask, why are we so sensitive? Do we change our fundamental policies every time a foreign government critiques us? No. Maybe a report will be used as an excuse, but a report isn't going to tip that balance away from cooperative relations between the United States and Turkey, in my opinion. And I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this amendment, and I recognize Mr. Engel.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first of all commend Mr. Connolly. He's a good member of this committee and very thoughtful, and we generally agree on most things. But on this one, I have to respectfully disagree and oppose his substitute. I know his intentions are very, very well, very, very good. The question here, as the chairman has mentioned, let's put this in perspective. What are we doing here? We're mandating a report. We're not taking any punitive actions against Turkey. We're not hitting them over the head. We're mandating a report. And I think that we need to put that in perspective. The findings on our bill, the findings on the bill, the chairman's bill, is based on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom report. It's also based on the State Department Human Rights report. So we're taking two reports that have been issued, and we are simply stating what these reports, which have already been done, are saying. Now, Turkey cannot have it both ways. You know, I am disturbed about recent trends in Turkey over the past several years by Mr. Erdogan. I am very much chagrined over what seems to be his authoritarian rule, his maneuverings to wipe away the secularism of the Turkish state, his attempts to neuter the military so that they are no longer a barrier in preventing the move towards an Islamist state in Turkey. I think those are very troubling. And I think while Mr. Erdogan doesn't hesitate to tell the United States when he thinks we're doing something wrong, I don't think that we should hesitate to tell him. And they can't really have it both ways. On the one hand, they say, well, we're an ally, so that should make you immune of any kind of criticism. On the other hand, when we look around and we've needed them, they haven't always been there. Yes, they're an important country, but we're not denigrating that importance. We're simply saying that the findings in our bill are based on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and the State Department Human Rights report. The other thing to put this bill in perspective, there are no sanctions or any penalty against Turkey in the bill. It's just a statement of what we believe is fact, which has been documented and proven about Christian properties. And so that's what we're doing. It's a finding, again, based on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom report, the State Department Human Rights report, and we're not imposing any sanctions. So I don't see why the chairman's bill should be opposed. We're simply stating what's a fact. No one's disputing the facts. We're saying, well, Turkish sensitivities, they may not like it, it's poking a finger in their eye. Well, you know what? We are entitled to say what we feel and what we see. And since there's, we are mandating a report here, we're not imposing any sanctions here, I think this is a very moderate bill and should be supported by everyone on both sides of the aisle. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to say I want to speak against the substitute amendment from my dear colleague from Virginia and speak in support of the underlying H.R. 4347. You know, one of the groups, a little background, one of the groups that I belong to, in fact, that I'm proud to be a member of, is the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. And last year, through the Commission's Defending Justice Project, I adopted a Vietnamese prisoner of conscience named Mr. Nguyen Tien Trung. My role was to bring attention to Trung's plight, and I'm proud to say that recently Trung was released from jail. And just this week, I adopted another prisoner of conscience in Vietnam, Pastor Win Kong Chin. Pastor Chin was unjustly sentenced to 11 years in prison in 2012 for simply practicing his faith and exercising his right to religious freedom. These cases have raised my awareness of religious intolerance around the globe, particularly in cases where it's systematically and institutionally practiced by various governments. The reason why we're here today and talking about this amendment and the underlying resolution is another sad situation where a government is actively hindering its own citizens' freedom of religion. There is no denying that the Republic of Turkey has a poor record on the treatment of Christians, and that's why the substitute amendment does not go far enough. Christian churches and communities in the Republic of Turkey and in northern Cyprus continue to be prevented from fully practicing their faith and face serious obstacles to reestablishing full legal, administrative, and operational control over stolen, expropriated, confiscated, or otherwise unreturned churches and other religious properties and sites. It should be pointed out that in the 3 years since the Republic of Turkey revised its law to provide legal process for claims to the return of religious properties that it has confiscated, that more than 300 Christian church properties have been returned. However, it is an encouraging sight, but with more than 1,000 applications for the return of the properties being denied by the Turkish government, it is clear that much more needs to be done. The only way we're going to change this situation is to convince the Republic of Turkey that it's through, and that is through international pressure, and that's why I think this amendment does not really deal with the underlying factors, and I oppose the substitute motion and encourage the support of H.R. 4347, and I yield back.
Hearing no further requests for recognition. Oh, Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I begin by saying I have tremendous respect for my colleague from Virginia, who I rely on a lot as a new member of this committee, a new member of Congress, and admire his thoughtful approach to this issue and to all the work before our committee, but I must respectfully oppose his amendment. I think it is correct that we have to be careful about both what we say and how we say it. And this underlying resolution or bill sends a message and creates a reporting requirement. But the substitute amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia, I think, makes assertions that just aren't true. It's a sense of Congress that Turkey has made progress in ending religious discrimination. We have the United States Commission for International Religious Freedom 2014 report, where they say Turkish secularism, as codified in the 1982 Constitution, requires absolute state control over religion, which leads to governmental interference and restrictions that hinder full religious freedom in the country. The government limits all religious groups' rights to own and maintain places of worship, train clergy, and offer religious education. This has been particularly detrimental to the smallest minority communities and their ability to transmit their faith to future generations. Other concerns include the listing of religious affiliation on national identity cards, societal discrimination, anti-Semitism, and persistent religious freedom violations in the Turkish-occupied northern part of Cyprus. Finally, it should be noted that the overall landscape for democracy and human rights has deteriorated significantly during the past year. So I don't think we should express the sense of Congress that Turkey has made progress in ending religious discrimination. In fact, the report goes on to say that they heard views from some religious minority communities that conditions had worsened and that the steps taken were negligible, as well as concerns that the improvements which are not codified in law could be easily revoked, especially in the current political environment. So I do think while some progress has been made on the return, or some efforts have been made on the return of property, that is reflected on page 3, paragraph 7. The underlying resolution acknowledges that, but this is an opportunity for us to again state or to share our values, to demonstrate that this is an important priority for our country, an important shared value, and I urge my colleagues to reject the substitute amendment and adopt the H.R. 4347 as originally proposed. With that, I yield back.
Hearing no further requests for recognition, the vote now, the question occurs on the Connolly amendment. All those in favor, say aye. All those opposed, say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment's not agreed to. I now ask unanimous consent that the following two amendments that were provided to members yesterday be considered en bloc and considered read. Grayson Amendment number 284 and the Holding Amendment number 851. Do any members seek recognition to speak on these amendments en bloc? Mr. Grayson.
Thank you. With regard to my amendment, Mr. Chairman, it's simply a matter of making sure that the terms are accurate and that we, to the extent we can, avoid language that might be misconstrued by any party. That's the purpose of my amendment. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Grayson. Mr. Holding.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for recognizing me and want to thank you for all the work you've done advocating for religious freedom across the globe. It's certainly an issue that I know is of great importance to many members of this committee and members of Congress. In this committee, under your leadership and the leadership of Chairman Smith, we've had examined the plight of many across the world who are prohibited from freely and safely practicing the religion of their choosing. As part of a delegation to Turkey last year, I had the opportunity to meet with Christian church leadership while in Istanbul, and there I heard firsthand about the ongoing difficulties in the process to get church properties not only returned but correctly identified and inventoried. However, it was also expressed that while this process was not proceeding as expeditiously as it should be, the government of Turkey and local communities had been making strides and positive developments were noted. That being said, Mr. Chairman, it's certainly my belief, and I believe the belief of many here today, that more can and should be done to move this process in the right direction. While the base text before us today does note some of the positive developments, I believe more could be added to recognize some of these positive developments, which is precisely what my amendment seeks to do. So I urge support, and I appreciate the Chairman and Ranking Member's support for my amendment. I yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Holding. I appreciate Mr. Grayson and Mr. Holding's contribution. The question now occurs on the Grayson and Holding amendments considered en bloc. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendments en bloc are agreed to. Are there any other amendments? Hearing no further amendments, the question occurs on adopting H.R. 4347 as amended. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendments en bloc are agreed to. Without objection, H.R. 4347 as amended is ordered favorably reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute. Staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes. As all members were previously notified, we now intend to consider en bloc the remaining 7 bills whose base texts were circulated on Tuesday. All of the amendments to those texts that were provided to your office, you got those yesterday, and so without objection, the following items will be considered. H.R. 2283, the Human Trafficking Prioritization Act, Smith Amendment number 58 in the nature of substitute to that bill, and Smith Amendment number 60 to that amendment. H.R. 4411, this is the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act, the Royce Amendment number 120 in the nature of a substitute to the bill, the Poe-Sherman Amendment number 92, and the DeSantis-Deutsch-Ming Amendment number 51. Then we go to H.R. 4640, the Western Hemisphere Drug Policy Commission Act, the Engel Amendment number 60 in the nature of substitute to H.R. 4640, and the Castro Amendment number 36. Then H.R. 4653, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom Reauthorization Act, the Smith Amendment number 55 in the nature of a substitute to the bill, and the Ming Amendment number 47. Next, we have House Resolution 435, calling on the government of Iran to assist in the case of Robert Levinson, and Ross-Layton Amendment number 49 in the nature of substitute. Next is House Resolution 562 with respect to enhanced relations with the Republic of Moldova, and Royce Amendment number 123 in the nature of a substitute. Finally, House Resolution 588 concerning the suspension of exit permit issuance by the Democratic Republic of Congo for adopted Congolese children. We have the Smith Amendment 57 in the nature of a substitute, and the Royce Amendment number 122 to that amendment. After opening remarks by myself and Ranking Member Engel, I will be glad to recognize any member seeking recognition to speak on the en bloc items. So first, let me thank Chairman Smith for authoring his bill, the Human Trafficking Prioritization Act. The fight against modern-day slavery has long been a priority for this committee. The annual report and country rankings by the State Department's Trafficking Office have turned trafficking into a global policy priority, but this annual work is a tug-of-war between those charged with assessing trafficking conditions and state officials concerned with the potential diplomatic fallout from stating very hard truths. This bill is intended to help level the playing field by elevating the trafficking office to a bureau without additional cost or personnel. Next, we have 4411, Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act. It was good to work with Mr. Meadows and Mr. Schneider and Mr. Engel on this critical legislation. The threat posed by Hezbollah's global operations, aided by a vast financial network, has exploded. In 2011, we saw the tip of the iceberg when a massive drug and money laundering operation for Hezbollah's benefit in weapons, logistics, and training were uncovered. To increase the risk in dealing with Hezbollah, the bill would target those financial institutions that knowingly do business with what has been called the A-team of terrorists. Then 4640 is the Western Hemisphere Drug Policy Commission Act, sponsored by Mr. Engel. The ranking member has been deeply involved in these issues, as has Subcommittee Chairman Salmon. The bill establishes an independent commission to conduct a comprehensive review and make recommendations on U.S. efforts to reduce the supply of illicit drugs. This includes an evaluation of the link between the illegal narcotics trade in this hemisphere and terrorist activities around the world. H.R. 4653 will continue the good work of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. The Commission is an independent body of distinguished experts who advocate for the first freedom of religious practice. This function has become even more critical as the State Department has dropped the ball in prioritizing religious freedom. So the Department has failed to make the required annual designations of the countries of particular concern for religious freedom violations since 2011. And the Ambassador-at-Large position for international religious freedom has been vacant now for a total of more than 3 years. So this bill carries forward the important work of this streamlined body and includes some needed management improvements. House Resolution 435 addresses the case of U.S. citizen Robert Levinson, who disappeared in Iran 7 years ago. The Iranian regime has continually obstructed U.S. government efforts to investigate his disappearance, despite promises of assistance. And this individual and his family deserve our every effort to secure his freedom and safe return home, and I want to commend Mr. Deutsch for his relentless efforts to securing Mr. Levinson's release. House Resolution 562 voices U.S. support for our relations with Moldova and for that country's sovereignty. They have had a long, difficult path. Democratic reforms have not come easily, but the Moldovan people have absolutely preserved in their expressed desire to join more fully with the West and with Europe. And recently, the Russian government has enforced trade embargoes and threatened the cutoff of energy supplies as consequences. This resolution stands by Moldova, and we urge its support. Finally, House Resolution 588, the Democratic Republic of the Congo has suspended exit permits for Congolese children adopted by foreign parents, affecting hundreds of families. And at this time, I would just like to briefly recognize the families that are here today from across the United States who have been impacted by the actions of the Congolese government. We're going to ask them to stand for a minute, those who are here, the families, if you would. And I want them to know we will continue to do everything we can for your families. Thank you very much for attending this hearing today, and as you can see, some of them are holding pictures of their adopted children. These children are barred from leaving the country to join with their parents here, even though the courts have declared these parents as their legal guardians. 900 American cases are caught up in this adoption limbo, and that breaks a lot of hearts here in the United States, and it breaks a lot of hearts of children in Congo. I witnessed firsthand the power of providing a child with a loving home when my Chief of Staff, Amy Porter, who's here with us, adopted internationally, and these children must be allowed to make their way to homes that desperately want to care for these children. Congressional approval of this resolution, of course, will send a strong message to Kinshasa that we need to unite these families. I now recognize the ranking member for his remarks on the en bloc items. Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this important markup. And once again, I'm grateful that we could work together in bipartisan fashion on all of these measures. First of all, let me express my strong support for H.R. 4411, the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act. Hezbollah has continued to terrorize the globe, reaching into Latin America, Europe, Asia, and across the Middle East. How does Hezbollah fund this violence and terrorism? Kidnappings and ransom, conflict diamonds, narco-trafficking, and other criminal enterprises. Claims that Hezbollah is simply just a political organization or a social services agency are simply naive, and this bill exposes the group for what it is, a vicious terrorist organization with a global footprint. This legislation goes after financial institutions that knowingly support Hezbollah. It's modeled after the Comprehensive Iranian Sanctions and Divestment Act of 2010. That measure worked. It's one of the prime causes of the severe economic downturn that brought the Iranians to the negotiating table. H.R. 4411 also focuses on Hezbollah's efforts to spread hateful propaganda through its media outlet Al-Manar, which is in itself a specially designated terrorist group. Through sanctions, we hope to cut off Hezbollah's lifeline and prevent future terrorist attacks. I want to thank Representative Meadows and Schneider for their thoughtful leadership on this issue and their bipartisan work. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for moving this forward, especially at this critical time. Next, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you for bringing up H.R. 4640, my Western Hemisphere Drug Policy Commission legislation. Let me also thank Congressman Salmon, who is the lead Republican co-sponsor of this legislation, a great partner of mine, and strongly committed to a strong U.S.-Latin American partnership. Despite at least $15.7 billion spent on counter-narcotics programs in Latin America and the Caribbean between 1980 and 2012, illicit drug use in our country remains high. In 2012, there were around 24 million illicit drug users in the United States, and while cocaine use at home is declining, heroin use is on the rise. In fact, heroin overdose deaths in the United States increased by an alarming 45% between 2006 and 2010. This bill would create an independent commission to take stock of what's working, what isn't, and help guide the future of U.S. drug policy through recommendations submitted to Congress. The Secretary of State and the Director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. This commission will save our government money in the long run. Its recommendations will help ensure that we're getting the biggest bang for our buck as we tackle this problem in Latin America and the Caribbean. A similar bill passed the House of Representatives unanimously in 2009, but stalled in the Senate. This year, I and Mr. Salmon are determined to get this legislation onto the President's desk. I would also like to express my support for H.RES 435, which calls attention to the disappearance of Robert Levinson in Iran more than 7 years ago. The United States has repeatedly raised Mr. Levinson's case with the Iranian government. Now is the time for Iran to make a good faith effort to bring Robert Levinson home. Thanks to the leadership and tireless work by Representative Deutsch, Mr. Levinson's congressman, this resolution will lend a new sense of urgency to this effort. Mr. Chairman, I would like to commend our committee colleague, Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey, as well as Representative Wolf, for their leadership on international religious freedom issues and for their work on H.R. 4653, which reauthorizes the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. Nevertheless, every day, religious communities around the world are subject to escalating violence, persecution, and discrimination. USCIRF is pushing back against violations and helping to uphold our most cherished values. I would like to again thank Mr. Smith for introducing H.R. 2283, legislation that would elevate the Bureau to monitor and combat trafficking to the status of a bureau within the State Department. Human trafficking, as Mr. Chris Smith has always pointed out, is a modern-day slavery and one of the most offensive violations of a person's freedom and dignity. Around the world, as many as 27 million people are victims of this heinous crime. Elevating this trafficking office to a bureau will send a message that combating modern-day slavery is a priority for the United States. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation. Mr. Chairman, let me also express my strong support for H.RES 562, a resolution introduced by Representative Pitts. This measure reaffirms our support for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Moldova, expresses strong support for strengthening U.S.-Moldova relations, and affirms that Moldova has a sovereign right to determine its own partnerships free of external coercion and pressure. I'm delighted that tomorrow Moldova will sign an association agreement with the EU. The resolution also calls on Russia to remove its forces from the Transnistria region of Moldova and urges all parties to work for a peaceful resolution to the Transnistria issue. I've met with Moldovan officials. They want to look westward rather than eastward. They're frightened to death about Russia's aggression, and it's very important that the United States stand by them. This resolution does that. I'm very proud of it. And finally, Mr. Chairman, we're taking up H.RES 588, a resolution introduced by Representative Peterson on adoptions from the Democratic Republic of Congo. We've seen all these brave parents stand up before. The government of the DRC has stopped issuing exit permits for adopted children, affecting hundreds of children who were set to be taken in by loving families. This is a terribly painful situation that we need to help resolve. This resolution recognizes the importance of ethical and transparent adoptions, and it seeks to raise awareness about the plight of the families currently stuck in limbo over these suspended permits. It encourages dialogue between the governments of the U.S. and DRC to find a path forward on this issue, and I urge my colleagues to support it. So in closing, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to once again thank you for holding this markup and for working with our side of the aisle in a bipartisan manner. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. Do any other members seek? Mr.
Chairman, thank you very much, and thank you for bringing these very important pieces of legislation to the full committee and hopefully to the floor very shortly. H.R. 2283, the Human Trafficking Prioritization Act of 2013, is a bipartisan piece of legislation. We have 91 co-sponsors, including some 13 who are members of this committee. And I want to thank Karen Bass for her co-sponsorship, and again, all the other members of the committee and the subcommittee. The Human Trafficking Prioritization Act will keep the fight against human trafficking from being downgraded or trivialized in the shuffle of politics of other U.S. interests. In the 14 years since my legislation, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 was signed into law, legislation that created the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking Persons, commonly known as the TIP Office. Many countries have said that they were strengthening their own trafficking laws, matter of fact, more than 130 of them, because of U.S. leadership guidance, prioritization, and accountability. The metamorphosis that's happened throughout the world really can be laid squarely at U.S. leadership, carried out so effectively and faithfully by the personnel at the TIP office. There are some 65 people who make up that office. Our Ambassador-at-Large, Lucy DeBacca, is doing an outstanding job. And in every embassy in the world, when members travel, there's always one person at least who is tasked in the embassy to work on trafficking issues. We hope our ambassadors and DCMs will also make it a high priority. But we have found a strategy that works. Now is the time to build on successes, however. For the sake of the 21 million people, the Free the Slaves puts that number at 27 million people who are captives of modern-day slavery, and we can do it without increasing the cost of government. H.R. 2283 will raise the status of the TIP office to that of a bureau within the State Department bureaucracy without creating new costs. These changes simply give TIP the latitude it needs, the voice it deserves, and above all, the line authority within state that it requires, and it gives the Ambassador-at-Large, who heads it, equal stature with the regional and the functional bureaus. Mark Lagon, who is was the Ambassador-at-Large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons from 07 to 09, testified here that the State Department does a tremendous job in producing a report which tells it like it is, offering objective rankings. Yet at times, he pointed out, it pulls punches, typically due to the urging of regional specialists rather than the TIP office specialists dedicated to trafficking. This bill will give the State Department's trafficking team the leverage necessary to allow it to advocate most effectively on behalf of victims of trafficking. We saw a need for this just last week when China undeservedly received an upgrade from Tier 3, egregious violator of human trafficking, to Tier 2 watch list, despite their atrocious record on trafficking. Hence, I'm offering another amendment that limits the ability, it's in the en bloc, so that after the 4-year cycle of being on the watch list, as long as they could be, there has to be an automatic movement up or down after 4 years. After you've been downgraded to Tier 3 after the 4 years, you get 1 more year, not a reset, so 4 more years, and China would game that system, believe me, for another 4 years, and they would stay off being cited and potentially sanctioned by the provisions of the law. Next, I want to mention H.R. 4653, which reauthorizes the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF. In 1998, Congress had the foresight to make the protection and promotion of religious freedom a priority in U.S. foreign policy by creating an ambassador at large for religious freedom, the Office of International Religious Freedom at the Department of State, and so, very importantly, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Importantly, this landmark piece of legislation, authored by Chairman Frank Wolf, IRFA created a system for naming and taking action against countries of particular concern, or CPCs. History has shown that when the U.S. makes religious freedom a priority, and that priority is conveyed to countries of particular concern, we have seen conditions improve with minimal harm to security or economic cooperation, but frankly, human rights ought to trump that. And in this case, it does mean that prisoners are set free, and the record is replete with those examples. 2.5 years ago, there was some problems with the reauthorization of USCIRF. It got bogged down in the Senate. I don't think that'll happen this year. It has to be reauthorized by the end of this fiscal year, or it becomes defunct. Dr. Robert George, who is the chairman of the commission, testified here just a few weeks ago before my subcommittee. And if any member travels anywhere, I strongly urge you to read their reports. They are incisive, they are accurate, they have action items, and those action items go to country that is committing deplorable acts against religious believers and leaders, clerics, bishops, and the like. But it also admonishes the administration and Congress to take effective action. For example, the President has not designated CPC countries, which is supposed to be done on an annual basis, since 2011. We have asked the President, we've asked the Secretary of State repeatedly, and USCIRF, Dr. George testified to that effect. Name those countries, and please apply sanctions where they're necessary. And finally, brief word about the very important, authored by Colin Peterson from Minnesota, on the Democratic Republic of Congo and the parents, some of whom are here. The government took the ill-advised action of cutting off adoptions. Many of those were already well into the process. Colin Peterson has picked up that baton, and he is pushing very hard. This will help, and again, to the families that are here, Congress has your back. We will do everything we can. I've been to DR Congo a number of times, along with Greg Simpkins. They need to listen. A home is awaiting kids who are orphaned. Thank you for your generosity, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you and Ranking Member Engel for bringing forward these important bills today. I want to especially thank you both, as well as my colleague on the Middle East and North Africa Subcommittee, Chairman Emeritus Ross Leighton, for your continued support of House Resolution 435, which calls on the government of Iran to fulfill its promises of assistance in the case of my missing constituent, Robert Levinson. Thanks to so many of our colleagues on this committee who have spoken passionately in the past about securing the release of the 3 American citizens detained in Iran. Robert Levinson disappeared from Kish Island, Iran on March 9th, 2007, 2,664 days ago. That's 2,664 days that his wife of 40 years, Christine, and their 7 children have gone without their husband, their father, and now their grandfather. He has missed the birth of 3 grandchildren in the year since his disappearance. When Bob first disappeared, the U.S. was not sitting across the table from Iran. Today, we meet almost weekly, and I know that our team raises Bob and the other American citizens' cases in every meeting, and I'm grateful for that. If Iran wants to show the world that they can be trusted, or that they can be taken at their word, then come through on the promise to assist in reuniting Bob Levinson with his family. Mr. Chairman, last week in our subcommittee markup, I spoke at length about the Levinson family and about Bob's commitment to his country over his 30-year career as an FBI agent. Today, I simply want to remind everyone watching, here and around the world, that the United States Congress has not and will not forget about Bob Levinson. I'd also like to commend the Chairman, Ranking Member Engel, and Congressman Meadows and Schneider for working to advance our efforts to crack down on the Iranian-backed terrorist organization, Hezbollah. Thanks for working with me and my colleagues, Mr. DeSantis and Ms. Meng, to include the language that would require reporting on steps other countries are taking to disrupt Hezbollah's illicit networks operating throughout the world. This legislation will help expose Hezbollah for what it really is, a global criminal and terror enterprise that uses every available avenue to fundraise and finance terror activities around the world. To say that Hezbollah is a resistance organization or a political party with a separate military wing is simply false. In just the past few years, we've seen Hezbollah plot and launch attacks in Europe, fully back and assist the murderous Assad regime in Syria, and expand its criminal activity in Latin America. We know that Hezbollah's fingerprints can be found on a broad range of activities in all of those countries in Africa, a whole range of activities from counterfeiting and credit card fraud to fundraising to weapons trafficking. Hezbollah members and supporters operate front companies as well as legitimate businesses used for money laundering and other fraud schemes. So as we continue to have a debate with some of our friends and allies as to whether it's possible to distinguish Hezbollah's political operations from its terrorist wing, and we know that it's not, this amendment will help us get a clearer picture not only of Hezbollah's reach, but what other countries are doing to disrupt Hezbollah's global operations. In addition, this language will ensure that the administration briefs Congress on these activities, ensuring close consultation as we work together to thwart Hezbollah's worldwide terrorism. Thanks again to the Chairman and the Ranking Member for working to make these measures bipartisan. It's critical that Congress shows that it is united on these vital security measures, and I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. George. Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. I want to particularly associate myself with H.R. 4411, the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act, introduced by the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows. The legislation is certainly timely in view of the developments in Lebanon and the Middle East region in general, and the nefarious role Hezbollah is playing. Hezbollah's sources of power have always been, in addition to Iranian-supplied weapons, financial transactions and foreign donations to keep the wheels of this terrorist organization running. Sanctioning entities that do business with Hezbollah is a significant step in our efforts to confront this issue. So I want to commend the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, for introducing this legislation, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back the balance of my time.
We go to Ms. Meng.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Engel. I appreciate the incorporation of the DeSantis-Deutsch-Meng amendment to the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act. This amendment strengthens sanctions against Hezbollah by enabling the disruption of Hezbollah's global logistics networks and its fundraising and money laundering activities. Furthermore, it requires the Obama administration to shed light on those countries that either overtly or covertly enable any sort of Hezbollah activities within their borders. This provision is particularly important in the Hezbollah context because there are far too many countries that outwardly condemn Hezbollah's military and terrorist activities while privately fostering environments where Hezbollah can operate politically and financially. Well, no more, not if you want to do business with the United States. I thank Mr. DeSantis and Mr. Deutsch for their leadership and partnership, the sponsors of the bill for crafting such important legislation, and the committee staff for all their hard work in putting it all together. I would also like to thank the committee for accepting my amendment to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom reauthorization legislation. USRF is invaluable, and I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this reauthorization bill and to support its passage today. My simple amendment revises the applicable anti-discrimination laws relating to USIF to bar discrimination at the Commission on the basis of religion. This is only fitting for a commission that's devoted to religious freedom. It is also appropriate given the sensitivities regarding which violations of religious freedom around the world the Commission chooses to focus on. My hope is that this amendment will help ensure the diversity, credibility, and strength of the Commission for a long time to come. I thank Congressman Wolf and Smith for their leadership on these important issues as always, and Janice Kaguyutan and Doug Anderson for their assistance with my amendment. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Ming. We go to Judge Poe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member for bringing all of this legislation up today. It's a good day in the Foreign Affairs Committee, all of this important legislation. I want to talk about 4 of the bills in the time that I have. First, the trafficking legislation that Mr. Smith has sponsored, and commend him for his long endurance in making sure that international trafficking is something that we recognize is a problem. And the work that he has done over the years, and now Congress is 2 weeks ago, we passed the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act out of the House, bipartisan legislation authored by Carolyn Maloney and myself, a unanimous decision on a roll call vote of all members of Congress that voted, going after the traffickers, the demand, and of course rescuing children. And that is the worldwide problem. That is the national problem as well. Unfortunately, my hometown of Houston, Texas is the hub for international minor sex trafficking that comes into the United States. And this legislation, along with Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, will let the world know where the United States stands on the issue of trafficking, that kids are not for sale, not here, not there, not anywhere. Hezbollah, terrorist organization, commend Mr. Meadows for bringing this legislation up. My amendment to this legislation encourages the State Department to offer the rewards program to get information about Hezbollah's finances and where that money comes from. It's the old-fashioned kind of the code of the West, the wanted poster. You post up some outlaw's photograph. We just say wanted now, not dead or alive, just wanted. Information about them. And other outlaws give information to the good guys, and they pay to get their buddies arrested. That has always worked. It's worked in the past with legislation that's already on the books. It's worked in Colombia. It's worked in other parts of the country or other parts of the world as well. So I thank Mr. Meadows, but also I think this amendment will help put some teeth in it and go get some folks brought to justice. The other point I want to, legislation is Moldova. I met with members of Parliament from Moldova. They came over here. They were nervous. They are worried. They think the Russians are coming and they're next. And we need to recognize the world the way it is, that Putin sees himself as Tsar Nicholas III. He wants the Russian Empire again. He went into Georgia. Mr. Smith was in Georgia right after the Russians were there. I was there about a week after him. We saw those tanks on the border with Russia and Georgia. Russia took 1/3 of the country, and the Russians are still in Georgia. They waited a few years. They took Crimea. Now they're in eastern Ukraine, and I don't see them stopping. So the West, primarily the United States, needs to make sure that the Russians know we are not Chamberlain. We're going to act like Churchill when it comes to aggression, and let the Moldovans know that the United States sees them as a partner and ally, and the Tsar Nicholas III needs to stay away from Moldova. And the last group I want to talk to are these wonderful mothers that are here. Thank you. God bless you for your tenacity. I can't even say it right. Tenacity in going and getting your children. That is something that is, it's just neat. It's great. It's God's work. I have 11 grandchildren, and my newest one of 4 months old is a special child. They're all special. But she's adopted. And my youngest daughter and her husband adopted a child. And when you get to pick the child, it's neat. So thank you for your work in rescuing children in this humanitarian effort, saving one child at a time. And thank you for your perseverance with Congress. Hopefully we can get, in this case, the Congo to do what is right. And so thank you for that. And Mr. Chairman, I will do something I rarely do. I'll yield back the rest of my time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the Chairman for the time and for the tremendous bipartisanship you have shown in this committee in general, and in particular with respect to H.R. 4411. to address one of the most critical national security challenges we face. I want to thank, special thank you to my good friend Mark Meadows, who with me initiated this bill, along with the chairman and ranking member, for their tireless effort on this important piece of legislation. I'd also like to thank the outstanding effort of the majority and minority staff, along with Ainsley Ryan from Mr. Meadows' staff and Tyler Stapleton from my staff, who have put so much time into perfecting this bill. The Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act is a leap forward in combating the threat of global terrorism financing. We have known for years that the international terrorist organization Hezbollah has planned, funded, and executed terrorist attacks in the Middle East, Europe, and the Western Hemisphere. Hezbollah continues to use underground networks and illicit materials to fundraise their global instability efforts. They have used U.S. and European banks, along with their subsidiaries, to hide and launder money out of South America and Europe to help finance thousands of Hezbollah operatives around the globe. One must only look at some of Hezbollah's past acts to understand the true threat they pose to U.S. national security. In 1983, Hezbollah bombed the U.S. barracks in Beirut, killing 241 Marines. In 1992, Hezbollah bombed the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, killing 29. In 1994, Hezbollah bombed the Amia Jewish Cultural Center in Argentina, killing 85. In 2006, Hezbollah operatives conducted cross-border raids into Israel, kidnapping IDF soldiers, which led to a 34-day military conflict between Israel and Lebanon. In 2011, reports indicated that Hezbollah was behind the bombing in Istanbul that wounded 8 Turkish citizens. In 2012, authorities apprehended a Hezbollah operative planning terrorist activity in Cyprus against civilians and commercial airlines. In 2012, Hezbollah bombed a tourism bus in Burgas, Bulgaria, killing 6 Israeli tourists and their Bulgarian driver. These are just a few of the activities of Hezbollah that have targeted U.S. interests and our allies around the world. We can and must do more to stem the global financing of these activities. Today we have the opportunity, and I hope that my colleagues will join in combating this pressing threat to U.S. national security. The Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act provides the administration with important tools to go after financial institutions, and institutions and satellite providers that provide material support and propaganda tools to Hezbollah. This important effort will result in fewer resources falling into the hands of terrorists who have shown great resilience in attacking Western targets, in addition to their destabilizing efforts in the Middle East. I want to again thank the chairman and ranking member, along with Mark Meadows, for working with us to introduce this important legislation. With more than 300 co-sponsors in the House, I hope that this committee will support its passage. I also want to express my support for the other measures offered today by members of this committee. It's a real pleasure to work with my colleagues and to share a deep personal interest in solving these complex problems. And I also want to welcome the mothers and thank you for what you're doing, standing up and continuing to fight so hard. Thank you for the chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Salmon.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Chairman. I would like to just make a few comments about H.R. 4640, but before I do, it's hard not to have your heart touched when you see such a wonderful group of mothers here. And I just want to remind you of one of the best sayings I've ever heard, and that is, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. And so you are making a difference. We see a lot of terrible things in this world, but you know, it's good to see great things, and it's good to see great people like you stepping forward, so God bless you. I'd like to thank Ranking Member Engel for partnering with me, or allowing me to partner with him on H.R. 4640, and I agree with you. This time it's going the distance. It's going to go all the way to the President, and it's so needed. And I thank the Chairman for bringing up all the bills today, but especially this one. You know, we've spent billions upon billions of dollars in fighting the war on drugs right in this hemisphere, and the war continues, and this bill is going to make sure that our precious taxpayer dollars are being spent in the most effective way that we can possibly do it. It establishes a commission that's going to evaluate across all the federal agencies what is working and what isn't, and that's just common sense. It provides this Congress with a report that will allow this committee and our partner committees to implement a legislative strategy to attack this vicious narco-trafficking criminal process and eliminate the scourge of drugs from our streets. But it's not just about drugs. The narco-trafficking criminal organizations, they support terrorism in our region, and they're actively participating in this current humanitarian crisis that's happening right on our border with the kids from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. In fact, I visited the facility in Nogales just a couple of weeks ago, where 1,250 children are sitting in cages. I don't know what else to call them. They're chain link rooms with razor wire on the top. And every one of those children is being brought to this country by coyotes that are aided and abetted by the narco traffickers, the cartels. And so it's a terrible scourge on our society. And I had to ask myself as I looked at those little children, how many of them didn't make it? How many of them are sold into sexual slavery? How many of them are murdered along the way? How many of them die in the desert of dehydration? We've got to solve the problem, but we've got to make sure that our drug policies are working, because it is the drug scourge that's funding these animals that are now preying upon these children. So fighting these criminal organizations whose staple is the drug trade, even though they branch out into human trafficking, is a U.S. national security priority. And this commission is going to help us provide lessons learned in the field to ensure we're spending our limited resources in the most effective way and putting us on a path to winning this war. Finally, I would like to say I'd like to congratulate Congressman Engel, the ranking member, for making sure that we're being fiscally responsible too, and that this bill, once we get the report, it sunsets 60 days after, so it's not one of those things, like Ronald Reagan said, the closest thing to eternal life is a government program. That's not the case here. So thank you very much, and I yield back.
Let's see. Mr. Perry, were you next? You were seeking recognition.
I'll take it, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. On House Resolution 588. Since September 2013, hundreds and hundreds of Congolese children and their adoptive American families have been affected by the suspension of exit permits in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Just yesterday, I got to hear the firsthand and very heartbreaking, heartwarming story of numerous families, including one in the district I represent, that have legally adopted and financially supported their 2 Congolese children, but have been unable to welcome them into their loving home. And I find it fascinating. Maybe the world doesn't know. I mean, the Congolese government's happy to accept the money. And these families have gone through every hoop, and they pay every month, and they don't know the status of their children. Imagine committing yourself to a child, having that child see you and wonder when the child's coming home, and the child, a little baby, doesn't understand and doesn't know why they can't come home with their loving parent, but they can't. The parents here in America, they pay the bill and they wonder what kind of care, what kind of treatment, and they know because they have lived it and they've heard. In many cases, they have lived it themselves, the horrific stories of the children that never do make it while they wait. Well, they were healthy when they started because of the conditions that they reside in, far away from their loving parents. They never get to come home. As a father of 2 beautiful little girls, I can't begin to imagine the uncertainty and the anguish these families go through. And we owe it. We absolutely owe it to these parents and the children to request that the DRC government resume immediately the issuing of exit permits, and to encourage and demand the State Department work sincerely and diligently. That's the other thing, Mr. Chairman. I heard stories about families that go to our embassy in the Congo and wait hours and hours and hours. These are Americans meeting other Americans and wait hours and hours for a 10-minute appointment to hear nothing new. It's unacceptable. We demand that the State Department works on these families' behalf and those children's behalf to bring this to a successful resolution and conclusion. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We go to Mr. Weber. Mr. Cotton.
Thank you. I associate myself with the comments of Judge Poe earlier. It's a good and proud day of this committee. It has been said by cynics that justice is the interest of the stronger, or put differently, that the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. We are blessed to live in a country where that is not the case, where justice is based on the natural rights of every person given to us by our Creator. But too often in the world, the strong do, in fact, do what they will, whether it's an outlaw regime like Iran pursuing nuclear weapons and holding American citizens like Robert Levinson in captivity, or a terrorist gang like Hezbollah that engages in drug trafficking, money laundering, arts and antiquity looting, and human trafficking to finance its activities around the globe. Criminal syndicates that prey on the most vulnerable people among us to gain their own money through human trafficking. Or a government that exploits orphan children at the expense of loving families. Fortunately, though, the strongest of the strong in the world is the United States. We are also the most noble and the most just. So I'm proud to stand with my colleagues on this committee. I'm proud to be a part today of the Foreign Affairs Committee to use American power and influence to deliver some small measure of justice to the wicked and to their victims alike.
Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is indeed an honor to serve on this committee. Your leadership and that of Ranking Member Engel is to be applauded. Before I speak on 4411, the tears that I see from many of the moms touch my heart. The prophet Isaiah, many, many years ago, said that we need to defend the cause of the orphan. So thank you for defending that cause. I want to speak on 4411 and offer my thanks to the chairman and the ranking member for their leadership, my friend Mr. Snyder for his unrelenting work, for the committee staff, for my staff, for those 313 co-sponsors that are on this bill, truly for the outside groups that have helped perfect this bill, for Mr. Deutsch, Ms. Ming, Mr. DeSantis, Mr. Poe, who made this bill better. But in thanking all of them, it's really not about any of us. It is about the target that Hezbollah has and about the victims that they continue to perpetrate their terrorist activities on each and every day. When we look at this, it is about the fact that there are today 40 to 60,000 rockets aimed at Israel by Hezbollah. Today, there is thousands and thousands of Hezbollah fighters in Syria. Today, there is trafficking of narcotics in Latin America, in Africa, and throughout the world because of Hezbollah. This terrorist organization does not relent, but we have a unique opportunity today. Because of global sanctions in other areas, we can put our foot on the neck of Hezbollah and finish them off by taking the financial resources they have and stopping it. I am pleased to be a sponsor of this bill. But more importantly than that, there are many others who say, well, what about Hezbollah? It may affect Israel and it may affect Latin America, but it doesn't really affect me. And that's where they're wrong. Because Hezbollah's reach is global. It is something that must be stopped. And I want to conclude with this, Mr. Chairman, by reading a quote from the U.S. Attorney of the Western District of North Carolina, my district that I represent, because we too have dealt with Hezbollah, and the quote is, Mohammed Hamoud was a student and a member of Hezbollah as a youth in his home country, and he came to the United States on a Hezbollah-driven mission. His loyalty accomplished his mission by creating a criminal enterprise which accumulated millions of dollars in profits, purchased businesses in the U.S., preached radical Muslim fundamentalism, and truly led a clandestine terrorist cell in Charlotte, North Carolina, raised funds for the cause, and saw that the funds were delivered to Hezbollah leadership in Lebanon. His guilty verdicts rendered by the jury were upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States, but during his time of imprisonment, while he was awaiting trial, he ordered the murder of the then prosecuting attorney and the bombing of Charlotte's federal courthouse. He continues to this day to pose no less a threat to our country and our citizens. if this is not enough for us to act today, if not for Israel, if not for Latin America, if not for Africa, then for the United States. And I urge the support, and I thank the support of all my colleagues on this particular bill. I yield back. Mr.
Well, we thank you, Mr. Meadows, for your authorship of the Hezbollah Financing Prevention Act and your leadership on this. We thank all of the members. I want to just mention also the contributions of our ranking members, ranking member of this committee, Mr. Engel, as well as all of those who offered up amendments and legislation that we have passed out today. Hearing no further requests for recognition, the question occurs on adopting the en bloc items. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The measure and amendments under consideration en bloc are agreed to. Without objection, each of the 7 measures as amended is ordered favorably reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute. Staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes, and that concludes our business today. The committee is adjourned.